6 hours before everything collapsed, the station was calm and orderly, just like it had been for the entire summit. Delegates from dozens of civilizations moved through the main corridors, their translators murmuring softly while security patrols watched from a respectful distance. Conversations about trade agreements, border disputes, and resource sharing filled the conference halls. For most of us diplomats, it was simply another routine negotiation, the kind that stretched across several days and ended with carefully worded compromises that satisfied no one completely, but kept the peace. My name is Turvik of the Neural Dominion, and for more than 30 years, I have represented my people in situations exactly like this one. During that time, I have negotiated with species whose tempers were legendary and with others who treated deception like a competitive sport. Compared to those assignments, the human delegation was supposed to be easy to manage. Humans had only joined the galactic community a few decades earlier, and most of the official reports described them as ambitious but predictable. They were classified as Deathworlders, of course, but many species held that label, and it rarely caused serious concern during diplomatic functions. What those reports did not properly explain was how humans behaved when they were threatened in public, especially when the individual involved was not a civilian but a trained soldier. That missing detail would become painfully clear before the day was over, though at the time, none of us had any reason to suspect trouble. The summit itself was being hosted on Meridian Station, a massive orbital hub positioned along one of the busiest trade routes in the sector. Because the station was considered neutral territory, nearly every major government had sent representatives. Merchant guilds, political observers, corporate envoys, and military advisors filled the docking rings and conference chambers. The human delegation was relatively small compared to some of the larger powers, but they still drew attention wherever they went. Their species had a reputation for surviving impossible conditions, and curiosity about them remained strong among the older civilizations. Most of the humans present were diplomats or technical advisors dressed in formal civilian clothing. However, as with every delegation attending the summit, they were accompanied by a small security detail. Among those guards was the individual who would later become the center of the entire disaster, a human marine assigned to protect his delegation during the negotiations. At the time, he appeared completely unremarkable. He stood quietly near the entrance of the conference wing, wearing a dark uniform with the insignia of the United States Marine Corps on his shoulder. His posture was relaxed but alert, and his eyes moved constantly through the crowd, with the calm awareness of someone trained to notice danger long before it became obvious. If events had followed the normal pattern of diplomatic gatherings, that Marine would have remained nothing more than a background figure, another silent guard among many others posted throughout the station. Unfortunately, the universe rarely respects careful planning when arrogance enters the equation. In this particular case, that arrogance belonged to my cousin, Varix, a young noble from my own dominion who had recently begun accompanying me to diplomatic events as part of his political training. Varix was intelligent, confident, and ambitious, but he also carried the dangerous certainty that our people were superior to most other civilizations. I had tried to warn him repeatedly that diplomacy required patience and restraint, especially when dealing with unfamiliar species. He listened politely whenever I spoke, yet I could always see the quiet disbelief in his eyes, as if he assumed my caution came from age rather than experience. For the first day of the summit, his behavior remained mostly acceptable. He attended meetings, observed negotiations, and asked thoughtful questions about the different delegations. Unfortunately, curiosity soon turned into something less productive. Varix developed a particular interest in the humans, though not for the reasons I would have preferred. He had read the same reports as everyone else, and like many young nobles, he interpreted the term Deathworlder as exaggerated propaganda rather than a serious warning. Several times during the morning, he commented on how physically unimpressive the humans looked compared to some of the larger species attending the summit. Their height varied, their bodies appeared relatively fragile, and their lack of natural armor or visible weapons made them seem ordinary. To someone inexperienced with predator species, that appearance could easily create a false sense of security. I reminded him that physical appearance often meant very little when evaluating an unfamiliar civilization, but my words clearly failed to make a lasting impression. By the time the midday recess arrived, the central promenade of Meridian Station had filled with delegates taking a break from negotiations. Restaurants, trading stalls, and observation balconies quickly became crowded with representatives from dozens of worlds. My cousin and I joined the flow of diplomats moving through the promenade, discussing the progress of the morning sessions while security teams maintained a discreet presence along the outer walls. It was during that walk that Varix first noticed the human marine standing watch near the entrance to one of the conference chambers. The soldier remained perfectly still while delegates passed by, his attention fixed on the surrounding crowd, in a way that suggested constant awareness without obvious tension. Most observers simply ignored him, understanding that security personnel existed precisely to blend into the background. Varix, however, slowed his pace and studied the marine with open curiosity. At first, I assumed he was merely interested in observing human military customs, but the expression on his face gradually shifted from curiosity to amusement. I recognized that look immediately, and a quiet sense of unease began to settle in. My thoughts. Experience had taught me that trouble often started with exactly that kind of careless amusement. I leaned slightly toward him and spoke in a low voice, reminding him that security officers from every delegation were performing their duties and should not be disturbed. He nodded casually, as if he understood, yet his gaze remained fixed on the human guard. For several seconds, he simply watched the Marine, as though evaluating him like an interesting exhibit, rather than a trained soldier responsible for protecting his people. At the time, I believed the moment would pass. Varix had shown arrogance before, but he usually possessed enough discipline to avoid public confrontations during official events. Unfortunately, the quiet confidence of that human marine seemed to irritate him in ways I did not immediately recognize. What happened next would take less than a minute, yet it would transform a routine diplomatic summit into a crisis that none of us could ignore. The promenade was busy, but the atmosphere remained relaxed. Delegates from different species gathered around food stalls, discussing trade terms and transport agreements, while station staff moved efficiently through the crowd. Conversations overlapped in dozens of languages, their meaning filtered through translator implants that kept communication smooth. In the middle of all that movement, the human marine stood exactly where he had been before, silent and watchful near the entrance to the conference corridor. Varix slowed his steps as we approached the soldier. At first, I believed he only wanted to observe him more closely, perhaps out of the same curiosity that many species felt toward humans. The Marine was slightly taller than average, broad through the shoulders with the steady posture of someone who would spend years training his body to react quickly under pressure. His uniform was simple but precise, dark fabric fitted to allow easy movement, and the small flag patch on his sleeve marked him clearly as part of the United States delegation. What caught my attention most, however, was the calm expression on his face. Humans often display their emotions openly, yet this Marine showed almost none. His eyes moved slowly across the crowd, evaluating every person who passed through the area. When his gaze briefly crossed ours, it lingered for only a fraction of a second before continuing its quiet sweep of the promenade dock to a trained diplomat. That behavior signaled professional discipline. To my cousin, unfortunately, It seemed to signal indifference. Varex gave a short, amused sound under his breath. "That is the famous human warrior?" he muttered through our private channel. "He looks like a merchant guard, not a soldier. From a death world." I replied carefully, reminding him again that appearances often hide dangerous realities. Humans had survived a world filled with predators, extreme weather, and constant environmental hazards. Even those who appeared calm and ordinary could be capable of surprising strength and speed. Varex listened but remained unconvinced. His confidence had grown throughout the morning, fed by his belief that the galaxy exaggerated humanity's reputation. Several nearby delegates paused briefly to greet me as we walked. While I exchanged polite words with them, Varex drifted a few steps ahead, still watching the Marine with open interest. The soldier noticed his approach immediately. His gaze settled on my cousin for a moment, measuring him with the same quiet focus he used on everyone else passing through the area. There was nothing aggressive in that look. It was simply the steady attention of a guard evaluating potential risks. Unfortunately, Varex interpreted it as a challenge. He stopped directly in front of the Marine, forcing the soldier to shift his stance slightly so that the entrance behind him remained covered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The surrounding crowd continued to move around them, unaware that a moment of dangerous stupidity was beginning to unfold. I stepped closer, intending to guide my cousin away before the situation developed further. Before I could speak, however, Varex addressed the Marine directly. "You are one of the human soldiers," he said, his tone carrying a faint edge of mockery that my translator reproduced with uncomfortable accuracy. "I have heard many stories about your species." The Marine did not react with offense or irritation. His expression remained calm as he answered in a measured voice. "Yes, sir. I'm assigned to security for the delegation. Is there something you need?" His response was professional and respectful, exactly the kind of reply expected from a trained guard interacting with foreign diplomats. If Varex had simply acknowledged the answer and continued walking, nothing more would have happened. Instead, he folded his arms and tilted his head slightly, studying the Marine as if he were evaluating a piece of equipment rather than a person. "I was only wondering," Varex continued, "whether the rumors about humans are true. Your species is supposed to be dangerous, but you look ordinary." The Marine remained still for a moment. His eyes flicked briefly toward me, perhaps recognizing that I held diplomatic rank within my delegation. When I gave a small gesture of apology, he seemed to understand that my cousin's behavior did not represent an official challenge. His shoulders relaxed slightly, though he did not move from his position guarding the entrance. "Sir," the Marine replied evenly, "I'm here to keep people safe. That includes you." For most individuals, that statement would have ended the conversation. It was calm, polite, and offered no insult. Yet Varex's pride had already been stirred, and the steady composure of the human only seemed to irritate him further. Around us, a few nearby delegates had begun to notice the exchange. Conversation softened as several observers turned their attention toward the small confrontation forming in the middle of the promenade. Experienced diplomats develop a keen instinct for tension, and the air around us had begun to carry that quiet signal that something was about to go wrong. I placed a hand lightly on Varex's shoulder, intending to guide him away before the situation escalated. "That is enough," I told him quietly. "The guard is performing his duty. We have other matters to attend." For a moment, it seemed as if he might listen. His posture shifted slightly, as though he were considering my advice. Then his gaze returned to the Marine's calm expression, and whatever restraint he possessed vanished. He stepped closer, invading the soldier's personal space in a way that no security professional could ignore. The Marine's eyes sharpened slightly, not with anger, but with focused awareness. His hands remained at his sides, yet his posture changed almost imperceptibly. The subtle adjustment of someone preparing to react if necessary, you humans claim. To come from a deadly world, Varric said, his voice now loud enough that several nearby observers could hear clearly. Tell me, soldier, do you truly believe you are as formidable as your reputation suggests? The Marine studied him for a long second before answering. His tone did not change, though there was a firmness in it now that had not been present before. Sir, I believe this conversation is becoming inappropriate. I recommend that you step back. Those words were not a threat. They were a warning delivered with professional restraint, the kind that security officers give when they hope to prevent a problem before it begins. Unfortunately, warnings are useless when someone has already decided to prove a foolish point in front of an audience. My cousin smiled slightly, as if he had been waiting for exactly that response. What happened next would take only a few seconds, but those seconds would echo through every diplomatic channel in the sector. Varric raised one hand and, in a gesture of arrogant dismissal, struck the human Marine across the face. The sound of the slap was sharp enough to cut through the noise of the entire promenade. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Delegates who had been walking past turned their heads, and several security officers along the corridor straightened, as their attention snapped toward the disturbance. For a moment, the entire section of the station seemed to freeze, as if everyone present understood that a line had just been crossed. The human Marine did not move. His head had turned slightly from the impact, but the rest of his body remained steady, balanced exactly where it had been before. Slowly, he brought his face back to center and looked directly at my cousin. The calm expression had not disappeared, but something behind his eyes had changed. The quiet watchfulness was gone, replaced by a focus that felt far more dangerous. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. Among experienced diplomats, physical assault during negotiations is considered one of the gravest possible violations. It was not simply rude or aggressive. It was a public act of hostility that forced security personnel to respond. My mind immediately began calculating the consequences. Station security, intergovernmental complaints, possible detainment of our entire delegation. What I did not yet realize was that those diplomatic consequences would soon become the least important problem in the room. The Marine's voice came out steady and controlled. Sir, he said, you just assaulted a United States Marine. There was no anger in the statement. It sounded more like someone confirming a fact for the official record. Around us, several human members of the delegation had already started, moving toward the scene, their expressions tightening as they saw what had happened. Station security officers were also pushing through the crowd, though they were still several seconds away. Varric, unfortunately, mistook the Marine's restraint for weakness. He laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound, the kind of laugh someone uses when they believe they have already won a confrontation. He glanced briefly at the small crowd forming around us, clearly enjoying the attention. In his mind, he had just proven that the famous human warrior was nothing more than another guard forced to tolerate the behavior of higher-ranked diplomats. You see? He said loudly, spreading his hands slightly. All the stories about human strength, and yet you do nothing. I stepped forward immediately. Every instinct I first possessed told me the situation was seconds away from turning disastrous. Varric, I said sharply, abandoning diplomatic subtlety. That is enough. Step back. For the first time since the confrontation began, the Marine's attention shifted briefly toward me. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that instant I saw something that made my stomach tighten even further. It was not anger. It was calculation. The soldier was deciding how to end the situation. When his gaze returned to my cousin, his posture had changed again. The adjustment was small, barely noticeable to an untrained observer, but anyone familiar with combat discipline would have recognized it immediately. His stance had become balanced, stable, and ready. He spoke one more time. "I'm going to ask you to step back now." It was the final warning. The surrounding crowd seemed to sense it as well. Several nearby delegates began quietly retreating, creating a small open space around the confrontation. Even the approaching station security officers slowed slightly, perhaps hoping the situation would resolve itself before they needed to intervene. Unfortunately, my cousin had no intention of retreating. Instead, he leaned forward again, invading the marine space with deliberate arrogance. His expression carried the smug confidence of someone who believed he was completely untouchable. "Or what?" Varex asked. The Marine did not answer with words. The movement that followed happened so quickly that many observers later disagreed about exactly what they had seen. Human reaction speed is already faster than that of most galactic species, and trained Marines spend years refining those reflexes until they become almost automatic. From my position, only a few steps away, however, I saw every detail. The Marine's hand shot forward and seized my cousin's wrist before Varex could react. At the same moment, his body pivoted smoothly, pulling Varex off balance while twisting his arm downward with precise control. The motion was not wild or angry. It was efficient, practiced, and brutally effective. There was a sharp cracking sound. Varex cried out as his arm was forced into a position it had never been meant to reach. Before the sound had even finished echoing, the Marine stepped forward, driving his shoulder into my cousin's chest and sending him crashing onto the polished station floor. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several nearby delegates stumbled backward as the sudden violence shattered the quiet tension that had been building around us. Station security officers broke into a run, pushing through the observers as they tried to reach the scene. My cousin lay on the ground, stunned and struggling to breathe. The Marine stepped back immediately after the throw, creating distance instead of pressing the attack. His hands remained open and visible, though his posture still carried the readiness of someone prepared to respond if the threat continued. From his perspective, the situation had been handled exactly according to training. An aggressive individual had assaulted him and refused repeated warnings to step back. The Marine had neutralized the threat quickly, then disengaged to avoid further escalation. Unfortunately for everyone involved, my cousin was not finished. Groaning in pain, Varex pushed himself up from the floor. His face had twisted into a mixture of shock, humiliation, and rage. The crowd watched in tense silence as he struggled to regain his footing. Then, ignoring the clear danger, he lunged at the Marine again. My cousin's decision to attack again removed a final layer of restraint from the situation. The moment he lunged forward, several people in the surrounding crowd reacted instinctively, stepping farther back to avoid being caught in the conflict. Station security officers were still moving toward us, but they had not yet reached the open space that had formed around the confrontation. For the next few seconds, the outcome would depend entirely on the two individuals standing in the center of that clearing. Despite the pain that was clearly running through his injured arm, Varex threw himself forward with reckless determination. His anger had completely overwhelmed his judgment. Instead of stepping away and allowing the situation to calm down, he attempted to grab the Marine with his remaining arm, clearly intending to strike him again. The attempt was clumsy and poorly balanced, the kind of movement that might intimidate an untrained civilian but posed little threat to a professional soldier. The Marine reacted immediately, though his response remained controlled rather than explosive. As my cousin's weight shifted forward, the soldier stepped slightly to the side and intercepted the attack with calm efficiency. His hand caught Varex's shoulder, while his other arm guided the attacking limb away from his body. The motion redirected my cousin's momentum instead of meeting it directly, and within a fraction of a second, the attempted assault had collapsed into another loss of balance. Before Varix could recover, the Marine used that imbalance to force him down. Again, the movement was not dramatic or theatrical. It was the precise, economical control used by security professionals trained to restrain aggressive individuals without causing unnecessary harm. My cousin was driven back onto the floor, this time face down with his arm pinned firmly behind. His back, the polished surface of the promenade, reflected the shocked expressions of the surrounding delegates as they watched the scene unfold. For most of them, this was the first time they had ever seen a human soldier in action outside of recorded military footage. The difference between rumor and reality had become painfully clear in less than 10 seconds. The Marine did not shout or threaten my cousin while holding him down. Instead, he spoke in a firm, steady tone that carried through the clearing with unmistakable authority. He informed Varix that he was now being restrained for assault and ordered him to remain still until station security arrived. The calm professionalism in his voice made the situation feel even more serious than it already was done. By that point, the station security officers had finally reached the edge of the crowd. Their uniforms marked them as part of Meridian stations, neutral enforcement authority responsible for maintaining order among the many visiting governments. They moved quickly into the open space, clearly prepared to separate the individuals involved and restore control before the confrontation escalated further. One of the officers immediately approached the Marine while the others positioned themselves around my cousin. Their leader raised a hand in a signal for calm and asked for a clear explanation of what had occurred. The Marine responded without releasing his hold, briefly describing the assault and the repeated warnings he had issued before defending himself. His account was concise and factual, delivered with the composed tone of someone accustomed to reporting incidents through official channels. I stepped forward at that moment, recognizing that my responsibility as a senior member of our delegation could no longer be delayed. Several observers were already whispering among themselves, and the presence of diplomats from multiple governments meant that whatever happened next would quickly spread through the station's political networks. If the situation was not handled carefully, it could damage relations far beyond our own delegation. Addressing the security officers, I confirmed that the Marine's description was accurate. I explained that my cousin had acted without authorization and against my explicit instructions to disengage. The admission was difficult to make in front of so many witnesses, yet denying the truth would have made the consequences far worse. Experienced diplomats understand that credibility is often the only tool capable of containing a crisis once it has begun. The officers listened carefully, their attention shifting between me, the Marine, and the restrained noble struggling angrily on the floor. After a brief exchange through their internal communication network, they instructed the Marine to release his hold so that they could take custody of the situation. The soldier complied immediately, stepping back and raising his hand slightly to demonstrate that he was no longer applying force. Two officers moved in to secure my cousin while another positioned himself between the Marine and the crowd. Varix continued to protest loudly, claiming that he had been attacked without justification, though his words carried little weight after so many witnesses had seen the events unfold. His injured arm hung awkwardly at his side, and one of the officers quickly signaled for medical assistance. As the situation finally began to settle, the tension in the promenade slowly eased. Conversations resumed in quiet tones while delegates exchanged concerned looks with their colleagues. What had started as a brief moment of arrogance had now become a public incident involving physical assault, diplomatic misconduct, and a member of the human military. The Marine returned to his original position near the conference entrance once the officers confirmed that he was free to do so. His posture regained the same calm vigilance he had shown before the confrontation began, though The surrounding crowd now viewed him with a very different level of respect. Many of them had just witnessed a clear demonstration of the discipline and speed that have built humanity's growing reputation within the galactic community. For my part, I remained standing near the security officers as they escorted my cousin away from the scene. The weight of what had just occurred settled heavily in my thoughts. This was no longer a simple disciplinary matter within our delegation. The incident had taken place in front of representatives from dozens of governments, and the human delegation had been directly involved. Diplomatic consequences were inevitable. What I did not yet realize was that the true fallout from this moment had only just begun, because the human response to the assault on one of their Marines would prove far more serious than most species in the galaxy expected. Station security quickly took control of the situation, and the tension that had frozen the promenade slowly began to loosen. 2 officers firmly restrained Varix, while another positioned himself between the Marine and the crowd, ensuring that no further confrontation could occur. My cousin continued to protest loudly despite the clear evidence surrounding him. The effort only made the scene more embarrassing for our delegation, because dozens of witnesses had already watched him strike first and then recklessly attack again after being warned to step back. The Marine did not react to the accusations being thrown in his direction. After releasing his hold exactly when instructed, he stepped away and allowed the station officers to take over, reflecting the discipline of someone trained to follow procedure even in the middle of a chaotic incident. Within seconds, he had returned to his original position near the entrance to the conference corridor, standing exactly where he had been before the confrontation began. Medical personnel arrived shortly afterward, moving efficiently through the crowd that had gathered to watch the incident unfold. From the expressions on their faces, it was obvious that the injury was serious, though not life-threatening. Heard when the Marine first redirected his attack had almost certainly been a dislocation rather than a break, a painful but controlled outcome that reflected the soldier's effort to restrain rather than destroy his opponent. As the medics worked, the leader of the station security team turned his attention toward me and requested a formal statement regarding the incident. By that point, I understood that the situation could not be softened or hidden. Too many delegates had witnessed and any attempt to distort the truth would immediately collapse under their testimony. With that reality in mind, I explained exactly what had occurred, acknowledging that my cousin had initiated the assault. Despite repeated warnings, the officer listened carefully while recording my statement through his wrist console. His expression remained professional, though there was a clear undertone of disapproval in his posture. Meridian Station hosted representatives from hundreds of civilizations, and maintaining order among such a diverse population required strict enforcement of conduct rules. A public attack on a security officer, particularly one assigned to protect the diplomatic delegation, was not a minor disturbance. Around us, the crowd gradually began to disperse as it became clear that the confrontation was over. Some delegates still lingered nearby, speaking quietly with one another while casting occasional glances toward the human Marine standing at his post. The earlier curiosity that many species felt toward humans had now been replaced by a more cautious respect. What they had witnessed was not uncontrolled aggression, but disciplined efficiency, the kind of response that neutralized a threat before it could escalate further. Varix, meanwhile, had finally stopped struggling. The reality of his situation seemed to settle over him as the medics secured his injured arm in a temporary brace. But it was now mixed with the realization that the crowd surrounding us had not seen him as a triumphant noble humiliating a human guard. Instead, they had watched him provoke a trained soldier and suffer the consequences within seconds. When the medical team confirmed that he could be moved safely, the security officers began escorting him away from the promenade. His protests resumed. The spectators who remained stepped aside to allow the group to pass, and quiet judgment I remained where I stood for a few moments after they disappeared into the corridor. The entire incident had unfolded in less than a minute, yet the impact it would have on diplomatic relations was likely to last far longer. Public confrontations involving military personnel rarely ended with simple apologies, especially when so many witnesses had seen exactly who started the violence. Eventually, I turned my attention back toward the human Marine. He was once again standing calmly at his assigned position, watching the flow of traffic through the promenade as though nothing unusual had occurred. His face carried the same composed expression it displayed earlier, and if not for the murmurs still circulating through the crowd, a casual observer might have believed the area had always been peaceful. For the first time since the confrontation began, I approached him directly. He noticed my movement immediately, though his posture did not change. When I stopped a respectful distance away, he gave a small nod of acknowledgement, clearly aware that I had been attempting to restrain my cousin before the situation spiraled out of control. "I regret what happened here," I told him carefully. "My cousin's behavior was unacceptable, and it does not represent the intentions of our delegation." The Marine listened without interruption, his attention steady but not hostile. When I finished speaking, he gave another small nod, acknowledging the statement in the same calm manner he had shown throughout the entire encounter. "Understood," he replied. "Sir, I was only doing my job." The simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any dramatic response could have. Within a few seconds, he had endured an unexpected assault, defended himself against a second attack, and then returned to his post without seeking recognition or revenge. It was the quiet professionalism of someone trained to handle chaos without allowing it to control his actions. As I walked away from the promenade, one thought continued to echo in my mind. Many species in the galaxy believed human strength was exaggerated by rumor and battlefield propaganda. After what had just happened, however, every witness present on Meridian Station now understood a far more important truth. Humans did not rely on reputation alone. When pushed, they proved it. By the time I left the promenade, the entire atmosphere of the station had shifted. Word about the confrontation was already spreading through diplomatic channels faster than any official report could travel. Meridian Station was a place where rumors moved quickly, especially when the story involved a member of the human military responding to a public assault. Delegates who had not witnessed the event themselves were already gathering fragments of the story from those who had, and every retelling carried the same central detail. A noble from our delegation had struck a human Marine in public and had been subdued in seconds. I knew exactly how damaging that narrative could become if it continued to circulate without context. Diplomatic perception often mattered more than the precise truth of events. In the eyes of other governments, what had happened would not simply be remembered as a personal mistake by one reckless noble. Delegations' discipline, judgment, and respect for interspecies protocol. That realization weighed heavily on my thoughts as I made my way back toward the conference sector. Inside the secure diplomatic corridor, the environment was far quieter, yet the tension remained noticeable. Members of various delegations were speaking in low voices while reviewing their data slates, clearly aware that something significant had occurred in the public promenade. When I entered our assigned conference chamber, several members of my own staff immediately looked up, their expressions reflecting a mixture of concern and curiosity. They had already heard that security officers had taken Varax into custody. I explained the situation without unnecessary embellishment. The room fell into a heavy silence as my staff processed the details. Several of them had warned me earlier that my cousin's arrogance might eventually lead to trouble during negotiations, but none of us had expected that trouble to appear in such a dramatic and public form. One of my senior advisors finally broke the silence by asking the question that was clearly on everyone's mind. He wanted to know how the human delegation had responded after the incident. His concern was understandable, because humans had developed a reputation across the galactic community for protecting their personnel with unusual determination. However, the humans had not yet made any official statement. The Marine involved had returned to his post with complete professionalism, and the rest of the human delegation had continued their scheduled meetings as though the disturbance in the promenade was merely an unfortunate interruption. Calm responses often meant that decisions were being considered carefully rather than emotionally. Not long after our discussion ended, a message arrived through the station's diplomatic network requesting my presence in a private meeting with representatives of the human delegation. They wanted to discuss what had happened, and as the senior member of my delegation present on the station, it was my responsibility to attend. The meeting took place in a neutral conference chamber within the station's administrative wing. When I entered the room, I found two human officials waiting at the table. One of them wore the uniform of a naval officer, while the other appeared to be a civilian diplomat assigned to the human embassy network. Their expressions were calm and professional. He had issued multiple verbal warnings before using force to restrain an individual who had assaulted him and attempted a second attack. The officer emphasized that the Marine's response had followed established rules of engagement for defensive situations involving military personnel on diplomatic assignment. I, civilian diplomat, listened quietly during this exchange before finally speaking. He explained that the human government viewed the safety of its service members as a matter of highest priority. The incident could not simply be dismissed as a personal disagreement between individuals. However, had been noted, and my immediate cooperation with station security had helped clarify the facts of the case. Those actions, he explained, demonstrated that the assault had not been authorized or encouraged by the leadership of our delegation. The distinction side wished to allow the reckless behavior of one individual to damage broader negotiations. Still, there would be consequences for what had occurred. Meridian Station's administration would handle the legal investigation regarding the assault itself. Would be provided. My cousin's conduct had already crossed a line that could not be ignored. The tension that had followed me since the confrontation began. The humans had handled the situation with the same disciplined calm their Marine had shown in the promenade. They had defended their soldier, clarified the facts, and ensured that responsibility for the assault was correctly assigned. As I stepped back into the station corridor, one thought remained firmly in my mind. The galaxy often spoke about human, yet what I had witnessed that day revealed something equally important. From anger or intimidation, it came from control, discipline, and the unwavering expectation that anyone who crossed a clear line would face the consequences immediately. The day's events continued to echo in my mind as I moved through the station corridors. Every glance from the other delegates, every hushed conversation, reminded me that Drex's actions had left a mark far beyond the immediate plaza. The Paka. Humans had not overreacted. They had not stormed the station in retaliation, but the calmness of their response carried its own warning. It was precise, calculated, and deadly in its implication. You may underestimate us, but any misstep will be corrected without hesitation. I found myself thinking about Captain Jenkins repeatedly, her composure and efficiency leaving an impression that no formal report could capture. She did not act out of malice. She acted within the bounds of strict military protocol, yet the results were as absolute as if she had planned every second of it. My role shifted subtly from observer to messenger, the weight of responsibility pressing on me with each step. I knew the next few hours would determine how the humans interpreted our reaction, and how my uncle would respond once the news of his son's fate fully registered in the Victorian High Council. There was a delicate balance to maintain. Acknowledge the gravity of the incident, ensure that justice was framed correctly, and prevent a diplomatic catastrophe that could spiral into war. Every detail I relayed mattered. Every hesitation or misstatement could escalate tensions beyond control. Walking to the administrative wing, I reviewed the sequence of events in my mind, noting how each gesture, each word, each reaction had contributed to the humans' decisive but measured handling of the situation. It was a lesson in restraint and lethal efficiency, a reminder that the galaxy's rules could be interpreted differently depending on who enforced them. In this case, humans enforced them with precision, and the message was clear. Underestimating their capabilities would carry consequences far greater than anyone in the Vexorian hierarchy could have predicted. By the time I reached the diplomatic wing, the full weight of this situation settled heavily on my shoulders. Security personnel and human liaisons moved with calm precision, their presence alone signaling that nothing would escalate without careful deliberation. Captain Jenkins was seated at a briefing table, her uniform impeccable, her expression unreadable. The humans around her worked efficiently, exchanging data, reviewing security footage, and preparing incident reports that would leave no doubt about the sequence of events. I realized that this level of organization was not just military competence. It was an unspoken declaration that humans valued accountability and clarity above all. The impact of that realization hit me as hard as the events in the Commerce District. Drex's arrogance had been met with an intelligence and restraint that was utterly foreign to the Vexorian approach. I watched as Ambassador Okonkwo outlined the proposed diplomatic process, carefully explaining to me how a neutral inquiry could resolve the matter while preserving the dignity of all parties involved. Every detail was considered: witness statements, timestamps, and legal precedent, all meticulously compiled to ensure that Captain Jenkins' actions were validated without compromise. It struck me that the humans had anticipated every possible objection, every potential escalation, and had structured their response to maintain control without resorting to vengeance or rash retaliation. For the first time, I understood the full measure of their strategic thinking. They were not reckless, but they were decisive. They had turned an incident that could have triggered interstellar conflict into a demonstration of both power and diplomacy. And in that moment, I grasped the broader truth. The galaxy had not been prepared for humans. We had thought them naive, inexperienced, and fragile, but they operated on a different set of rules that combined calculated force with disciplined protocol, a blend that made misjudging them not just dangerous, but potentially catastrophic. Sitting there, I knew that my uncle's reaction, my own role, and the future interactions between our species would now be shaped by the reality Captain Jenkins had imposed in those 3 terrifying seconds. It was a lesson none of us could ignore. Challenge a human, and you might live or you might learn painfully that the consequences are measured differently when they decide the terms. The station was quiet in the immediate aftermath, but the tension hung like a charged plasma field. Security personnel were arriving, moving cautiously, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe. I stayed back, my optical sensors locked on. Jenkins, who remained composed, her breathing even, her posture relaxed but alert. She wiped Drex's blood from her hands with the same calm efficiency she had shown in the fight, and I realized then that this human, this Marine, was operating on a completely different level of discipline and capability than anything the Vexorian hierarchy had prepared me for. Across the plaza, beings from multiple species whispered and stared, some in awe, some in fear, all processing what they had just witnessed. It was not just the swiftness of her actions, though that was impressive. It was the absolute certainty, the total control, the fact that she had neutralized a threat without hesitation and without losing herself to rage or panic. Drex, my cousin, who had been an unstoppable force in our eyes, A political heir with every advantage of lineage and influence lay unmoving at her feet, and in that moment, the unspoken truth became clear. You cannot measure humans by the same rules that govern other species. They defy expectation. They respond to aggression with precision, decisiveness, and when necessary, lethal efficiency. The realization settled in my mind with the weight of a collapsing star. These humans were not simply another species to negotiate with or educate. They were a force shaped by survival, by constant challenge, by the raw realities of a death world that had demanded they adapt or perish. I felt a chill run through my scales as Jenkins turned her gaze toward me, her eyes calm, assessing almost, measuring whether I, a representative of my people, understood the scope of what had just occurred. Your cousin learned an important lesson, she said, her voice carrying across the plaza, still calm, still unwavering. I nodded, unable to form words, fully aware that the lesson she had delivered in 3 seconds was worth more than any council directive or diplomatic protocol could teach. Around us, life began to resume its tentative rhythm, but the impression of those 3 seconds lingered, etched into the memory of every observer present. It was a stark, unambiguous demonstration of human capability, of the lethal consequences of underestimating a species still labeled primitive by many in the coalition. I realized then that my task as a diplomat, my role as an observer, had changed fundamentally. It was no longer enough to monitor, to report, to guide. I had witnessed a paradigm shift, a demonstration of raw efficiency and disciplined aggression. That demanded recalibration in how my people interacted with humans. And as Jenkins straightened, adjusted her uniform, and returned to her booth as if nothing extraordinary had happened, I understood one thing clearly. The galaxy had underestimated humans, and that underestimation had the potential to reshape interstellar politics, alliances, and expectations entirely. 6 hours later, I found myself in the station's diplomatic wing, seated across from 3 humans who exuded authority in a way that made my scales itch with apprehension. Colonel Marcus Webb, grizzled and efficient, sat to my left, eyes sharp and calculating. Ambassador Patricia Conkle radiated calm intelligence, her gaze unflinching as she assessed me with quiet control. And Captain Angela Jenkins, the Marine who had just ended my cousin's life in 3 seconds, sat before me. A faint bandage on her lip, the only sign of her involvement, her posture relaxed, her expression unbothered, almost serene. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing down, the unspoken understanding that these were beings who operated on a different set of rules entirely. Okonkwo spoke first, her voice smooth and precise, articulating the situation clearly. She outlined my uncle's threats, the demands for justice over Drex's death, and the potential for interstellar conflict if he pursued the matter without restraint. I listened, every word confirming what I had already feared. Humans were not only capable of lethal precision, they were capable of controlling its consequences, framing their actions with logic and foresight that outmaneuvered even the most calculated political schemes of my people. Webb leaned forward, recounting historical context in human military culture, the principle of proportional response, the precedent of defending oneself without triggering unnecessary escalation. Every example was grounded in reality, in experience, in a pragmatic understanding of action and consequence. As I processed their explanations, Jenkins slid a datapad across the table toward me, filled with official incident reports, witness statements, and timestamps. Every document confirmed the same sequence of events. Drex had initiated aggression. Jenkins had responded according to her training, and the outcome, though lethal, was entirely justified. I studied the evidence, feeling the full weight of its implications. My uncle, steeped in Vexorian honor culture, would never accept this outcome easily. In our society, The death of a high-ranking heir demanded recompense. Letting it go without blood would be seen as weakness, a loss of face for the family, the council, and the sector. But the humans had anticipated this. Okonkwo proposed a solution. A formal inquiry conducted by a neutral third party, the Thalaxian Judicial Council, to examine the evidence and make a ruling. During the inquiry, my uncle could present his case, pursue justice through official channels, and maintain the appearance of authority without plunging the galaxy into war. It was a brilliant compromise, a way to preserve honor while preventing escalation, and I realized for the first time that the humans had not only won the physical confrontation on Meridian 9, they had already won the strategic and diplomatic battle as well. Webb leaned back, his expression firm but calm, and Jenkins sat silently, her gaze steady, waiting. I understood then that humans measured victory differently. For them, action, consequence, and the preservation of life through careful, calculated force were inseparable. In 3 seconds, she had ended my cousin's life. In 6 hours, she had prevented a potential interstellar crisis. The galaxy had misjudged humans, and now I, Thurvan Vivian, had the unenviable task of explaining to my people that we had underestimated an entire civilization. 2 hours later, the response from my uncle arrived. The subspace transmission flickered to life, his image filling the screen with the imposing presence I had grown up fearing, yet now tinged with exhaustion and grief. His face cycled through shock, anger, and sorrow, settling finally on a cold, calculating composure. "I have reviewed your message," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "I have also received communications from several council members who have been contacted by human diplomats. They all advise the same course. Accept the inquiry, maintain face, and move forward." I nodded silently, careful to hide my relief. "Uncle, this is the right path. Justice will still be served, but through proper channels," I said, my voice measured. For a long moment, he said nothing, staring past the camera as if weighing the unseen consequences. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now, almost personal. "Tell me, nephew, do you think this human regrets taking my son's life?" I considered Jenkins, calm, controlled, unwavering, even after 3 seconds of deadly force. "No, uncle. She does not regret defending herself. But I believe she regrets that it came to that." There was a pause, filled with the weight of loss, honor, and the cold calculus of political consequence. "Drex was my only child," he continued, his voice hollow. "Thurvan my heir, my legacy. And he died because he was too arrogant to understand that the universe does not care about our pride." I swallowed, my own scales tightening under the strain of his words. "I know, uncle. I am sorry." His shoulders straightened slightly, the weight of authority returning as he exhaled. "I will accept the inquiry. I will abide by the ruling, whatever it may be. But deliver a message to that human marine for me. Tell her that my son's death was his own fault, that I hold her responsible for nothing. Tell her I hope she lives a long life, for someone should benefit from the lesson his arrogance has taught." The transmission ended, leaving me staring at the blank screen, the enormity of the situation pressing down. Jenkins had not only defended herself, she had reshaped the political landscape, forced a high-ranking council to reconsider the rules of engagement, and given us a way out of a situation that should never have occurred. The humans had not just reacted, they had anticipated, calculated, and executed a solution that preserved life, honor, and stability simultaneously. I realized then, fully and irrevocably, that the galaxy had misjudged them completely. Humanity did not operate by the same constraints as the rest of the coalition. They measured threats differently. They calculated consequences with precision, and they had the will and discipline to enforce both without hesitation. And through all of it, Captain Angela Jenkins remained calm, professional, and entirely unshaken by the chaos she had just turned into order. 3 days later, I found myself in the station's diplomatic wing as the Thalaxian Judicial Council officially opened their inquiry. The chamber was vast, filled with the muted hum of procedural machinery and the quiet murmurs of various species awaiting the session. I could see Jenkins moving among her fellow Marines, each of them offering quiet support, patting her shoulders and sharing whispered jokes that I did not fully understand. She caught my eye and gave a subtle nod, her composure unbroken, her focus absolute. The inquiry was formal, extensive, and meticulous. Witness statements were collected from dozens of beings across multiple species, all corroborating the sequence of events. My cousin Drex had initiated physical aggression, issuing illegal orders, and culminating in an unprovoked slap against a United States Marine. Every statement, every record, every timestamp confirmed the same truth. Jenkins had acted in self-defense, and her response, though lethal, had been justified. I watched the proceedings quietly, absorbing the efficiency, the fairness, and the precision of human legal protocols. It was striking. This was not just military discipline in action, but a full-spectrum demonstration of law, ethics, and strategy executed flawlessly under pressure. Afterward, I saw Jenkins again in the corridor, surrounded by her fellow Marines. She approached calm and steady and asked about my uncle, about his reaction to the inquiry. I explained that he had accepted the proceedings, that he would abide by the ruling, and that war had been averted. She nodded, her expression thoughtful yet serene. "Good," she said simply. I meant what I said in the conference room. I did not want anyone to die because of me. I studied her closely, realizing that this human who had ended a life in 3 seconds, prevented a war, and maintained unshakable professionalism was a living embodiment of disciplined chaos. She had upheld her duty, defended herself, and yet acted with a level of calculated restraint that most species would never comprehend. I asked her finally, "Captain Jenkins, do you think about it? About taking his life?" She paused, her gaze distant for a moment, and then said, "Every day. I have trained my entire adult life to be ready for combat. Taking a life, even in self-defense, even when justified, it stays with you. But do I regret it? No. I regret that it had to happen. I do not regret defending myself." She extended her hand, a gesture I had learned represented peace and mutual understanding. I took it carefully, feeling the strength and resolve behind it. Through her, I saw a future in which humanity would not merely exist among the stars. They would define the rules, enforce consequences, and do so with a clarity and decisiveness unmatched by any species in the coalition. As she rejoined her unit, the camaraderie and ease of her fellow Marines contrasting sharply with the gravity of what had occurred, I realized the galaxy was witnessing not just the emergence of a new power, but the arrival of a civilization that operated on principles of strength, fairness, and unflinching readiness. Captain Jenkins and her peers had shown that humans did not simply react, they preempted, calculated, and executed with a precision that rendered traditional diplomacy almost obsolete. In that moment, I understood fully why the galaxy would never be the same. Humans had arrived, and they would not simply integrate. They would redefine the standards of conduct, conflict, and defense, all while preserving the dignity and principles of their own culture. Months later, the Thalaxian Judicial Council reached its decision. Jenkins had acted in lawful self-defense, and the evidence was irrefutable. My uncle, after careful deliberation, accepted the ruling with dignity, understanding that the legal process had preserved his honor while preventing unnecessary conflict. The Victorian High Council issued a formal statement, emphasizing respect for personal boundaries and acknowledging that every species retained the right to defend themselves. Jenkins, meanwhile, was promoted to major and assigned to a new diplomatic posting. Her actions recognized not only for their bravery, but for their strategic impact in averting an interstellar war. Observing her, I realized the magnitude of what had happened. One human, in 3 seconds, had changed the course of interstellar diplomacy, demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of human combat training, and showcased the unparalleled combination of discipline, restraint, and tactical foresight that defined her species. The galaxy, which had long relied on hierarchy, protocol, and lineage, was forced to acknowledge a new paradigm. Humans did not merely obey rules, they enforced their own. They did not ask for permission, they made others reconsider consequences. And they did so without hesitation, without malice, but with a clarity and decisiveness that demanded respect. In the weeks that followed, the humans continued to prove their value. When pirates attacked a civilian convoy, a human patrol ship arrived within 40 minutes and neutralized the threat in under 10. When a plague struck a remote colony, human medical teams worked tirelessly for weeks to ensure every patient survived. When territorial disputes arose, a single human dreadnought's presence reminded potential aggressors of the consequences of miscalculation. I watched all this, my perception of strategy, diplomacy, and interstellar power fundamentally altered. We had spent thousands of cycles building a civilization around status, lineage, and complex codes of honor. Humans arrived and quietly enforced one simple rule: treat each other decently, or we will make you regret it. They were not simply another species to join the galactic coalition. They were a force that reshaped expectations, redefined engagement, and ensured that the universe understood the true meaning of readiness and resolve. I, Thurvan Vivian, survived. The day my cousin Drex learned why you never, under any circumstances, slap a United States Marine. And more importantly, I learned why the galaxy would never again operate on the same assumptions we had made for thousands of cycles. Humanity had arrived, and the stars would never be the same.